Dublin, 1838. Dr. Aldous Pemberton slammed the 7-year-old girl's wrist onto the iron table so hard the bone cracked. And he didn't stop. He pressed the electric rod against her small arm and held it there while she screamed, scribbling notes with his free hand. Not once did he look at her face. In the next room, her twin sister collapsed to the floor, convulsing, untouched, unwired, and completely alone. No one came. No one asked why. Someone made sure no one ever would. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story until the very end, and drop a comment with the city where you're watching. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The year was 1838, and Dublin was a city cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. On one side of the River Liffey stood the grand stone townhouses of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy. Men in tall hats, women in silk, physicians and priests who believed they had been appointed by God himself to decide the fate of lesser people. On the other side lived everyone else. The Irish Catholic poor, the laborers, the forgotten. Men and women who worked their fingers to the bone building a city that would never truly belong to them. Declan Callahan was one of those men. He was a broad-shouldered dockworker, Catholic to his marrow, with calloused hands and a quiet pride that no poverty could strip away. He had survived famine seasons that took neighbors and cousins. He had watched British landlords evict families into the rain without blinking. He had endured the kind of daily humiliation that grinds a man down slowly, the way water erodes stone, almost invisibly, until one day you look and half of you is simply gone. But Declan had something most men around him did not. He had Bridget. Bridget Callahan, name alone, was a small woman with red hair gone prematurely gray and eyes the color of river water in winter. Pale green, deep, difficult to read. She was known in the Liberties district as a healer, not a doctor, not a licensed practitioner, certainly not anything that the Royal College of Surgeons would recognize. She knew herbs, she knew timing, she knew when a fever would break and when it wouldn't. She had saved 3 children from consumption the winter before, and the mothers of those children would have walked through fire for her. But knowing things you are not supposed to know in a city like Dublin, in a time like 1838, was never safe. Not for a woman, not for a Catholic, not for the poor. On a gray morning in February of that year, Bridget went into labor. She did not call for a doctor. Declan ran to find the midwife, a stout woman named Nora Feeney, who had delivered half the children in the Liberties and had forgotten more about birth than most physicians ever learned. Nora arrived fast, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. The labor was hard, longer than it should have been, and then, just before dawn, 2 girls came into the world. Siobhán and Aoife Callahan, born within 7 minutes of each other, identical in every feature that Nora could examine by candlelight. The same dark lashes, the same faint flush of color in their cheeks, the same small mouths already moving as if searching for something to say. The room was quiet, in the way rooms sometimes go quiet after a great effort. And then Nora Feeney did something that she would later refuse to explain clearly. She crossed herself. Not once, 3 times. Declan noticed. "What is it?" he said, moving toward the bed. "Nothing," Nora said quickly, too quickly. "They're healthy, both of them, healthy and whole." She wrapped the girls and handed them to Bridget, and she kept her eyes down while she did it, and she left the house before the sun had fully risen, and she did not charge for her services that morning. Declan told himself it was nothing. Women were superstitious. The church had filled everyone's heads with signs and portents. There was nothing unusual about 2 healthy girls born to a healthy mother. He told himself that for approximately 3 years. Then he stopped being able to. Siobhán and Aoife were not unusual children in any obvious way. They were bright. They were quick. Siobhán was the louder of the two. She laughed easily, asked questions constantly, and had an opinion about nearly everything, which was not considered an asset in a girl child in 1838 Dublin. Aoife was quieter, more watchful, with a way of looking at you that made grown adults feel as though they were being assessed and found interesting rather than merely observed. They learned to talk early, sentences before 18 months, full conversations before 2 years. And here was where things began to feel strange, though at first Declan could not quite put his finger on it. They never argued. Not once. Not the way other children argued, over toys, over attention, over the small, fierce territorial battles that fill up childhood. They simply never seemed to disagree. Not because one deferred to the other, but because they appeared from the very beginning to already know what the other was thinking. One morning, when the girls were nearly 3, Declan came in from work to find Bridget standing very still in the center of the room, watching them. Siobhán was on one side of the kitchen table, Aoife on the other. They were not looking at each other. Siobhán was playing with a length of rope, tying and untying a knot. Aoife was staring at the wall. Every time Siobhán tied the knot, Aoife's left hand closed into a fist. Every time Siobhán untied it, Aoife's hand opened. They were not watching each other. There was no possible way they were coordinating. "Bridget," Declan said softly. "I know," she answered, without turning around. "How long has this?" "I don't know," she said. "A while." She paused. "Maybe always." He stood there and watched his daughters for a long time that evening. And something moved through him that was not quite pride and not quite fear, but lived uncomfortably close to both. He said nothing more about it that night. The neighbors, however, were not so quiet. In a district like the Liberties, dense with people living pressed against one another in tenements and cramped lane houses, where everyone heard everything and privacy was a luxury that only money could buy, it was impossible to keep anything truly hidden. And the strange symmetry of the Callahan twins was the kind of thing that neighbors noticed and talked about, first with curiosity, then with something edgier. Old Mrs. Duffy from the floor above said the girls gave her an uneasy feeling she couldn't name. A boy named Tommy Byrne, 8 years old, told his mother that he had pushed Siobhán in the alley, and Aoife, who was inside the house at the time, had started crying and grabbed her own arm with a bruise would later appear on her sister. Tommy's mother dragged him home by the ear and told him not to play with the Callahan girls anymore. And then came the incident with the Connolly child. Patrick Connolly was 4 years old, the son of a tailor who lived 2 streets over. He had been sick for nearly a week, a rattling cough that had the hollow sound that mothers recognized with dread in those years, the sound that could mean nothing or could mean everything. His mother, Kathleen Connolly, was at the point of desperation. She had prayed. She had given him the remedies she knew. Nothing was working. Someone, and no one would later admit who, told her to go see Bridget Callahan. So Kathleen went. She knocked on the door of the Callahan house on a Tuesday afternoon, holding her small son against her chest, and Bridget let her in without ceremony, the way she always did. The twins were in the room. Bridget was examining the boy when Siobhán walked over, stood beside Kathleen, and said, in a completely matter-of-fact voice, "He's going to be all right, but he needs to stay out of the cold for 7 more days. After 7 days, the sound in his chest will stop." Kathleen looked at the child, startled. Bridget shot a look at Siobhán that said, clearly, this is not the time. Aoife, from across the room, without turning around, said, 7 days. No cold air. Kathleen Connolly stared at both of them. She took her son home. She kept him inside for 7 days. On the 8th morning, the cough was gone. Completely. The rattling sound, the hollow darkness in it, simply gone. She went back to the Callahan house, and she stood at the door, and she looked at Bridget, and she said, "How did they know?" Bridget said, Children sometimes say things. Bridget. Kathleen's voice was low and very serious. How did they know? Bridget did not answer. Kathleen Connolly went home, and she told her husband, and her husband told 2 men at the tavern, and those 2 men told their wives, and within a week the story had spread across 3 parishes. And now Dublin was listening. Not all of it wanted to hear what it was hearing. Father Cormac Sheehan was the priest of the local parish, a thin, rigid man who had been shaped by the church the way iron is shaped by fire, into something hard and unyielding and very sure of its own edges. He heard the rumors about the Callahan twins. He heard about the Connolly boy. He heard about other small things. The way the girls had pointed once to a spot along the quay wall where a man's lost pocket watch was later found. The way Aoife had told a neighbor's wife to check on her mother in Wicklow, and when the woman had finally made the journey, her mother had been found collapsed on the floor of her cottage, barely alive. Father Sheehan called Declan Callahan into the vestry on a cold Thursday morning. Declan came respectfully, hat in hand, the way a Catholic working man came when his priest summoned him. He stood in the stone-cold room, and he waited. Father Sheehan looked at him for a long moment. "Your daughters," he said at last. "Yes, Father. There are stories being told." "There are always stories being told, Father." The priest's eyes were flat and careful. "These stories are different, Declan. You know that as well as I do." He paused. "I need you to bring them to me for examination." Declan's jaw tightened. "They're children. They are children who are frightening half this parish." Father Sheehan's voice did not rise. That was somehow worse. "There are things that can look like gifts from God that are not gifts from God, Declan. You understand me?" Declan understood him perfectly. He took his hat off the pew beside him, turned it in his hands once, and said, "I'll speak to Bridget." He walked out of the vestry and into the cold Dublin morning, and he did not speak to Bridget that day, or the next. But he lay awake both nights in the dark, listening to his daughter's breathing in the next room, and he thought about Father Sheehan's eyes, that flat, careful look, and something cold moved through him, because he knew, in the way that fathers know things they do not want to know, that the priest was not the most dangerous person who had heard the rumors. He just didn't know yet who was. He would find out soon enough. They all would. Declan Callahan was not a man who frightened easily. He had lived through enough to know the difference between a threat and a shadow. But the week after Father Sheehan's summons, he started waking up at 3 in the morning for no reason he could name, lying in the dark with his eyes open, listening. Not to anything in particular, just listening. The way an animal listens when something is changed in the air and it doesn't yet know what. Bridget noticed. She noticed everything. One morning, she set his tea in front of him and said, without preamble, "You're going to tell me what Sheehan said to you." Declan wrapped both hands around the cup. "He wants to see the girls." Bridget sat down across from him. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "No." "Bridget." "No, Declan. I know what that means. I know what examination means when a priest says it about a child who's done nothing wrong." Her voice was quiet, but there was iron in it. "My girls are not going into that vestry." "He'll push." "Let him push." She stood and went back to the fire, and the conversation was over. But Father Sheehan was not the one Declan should have been watching. 3 days later, a man appeared in the neighborhood who did not belong there. He was tall, well-dressed by the standards of the Liberties, which meant his coat was whole and his boots had no holes. He carried a black bag. His name, as he introduced himself to the landlord of the Lane House and to 2 shopkeepers on the corner, was Dr. Edmund Hargrove. He said he was conducting a survey of public health conditions among Dublin's laboring poor, commissioned by the university. He was polite, he was precise, he smiled at exactly the right moments. Nobody trusted him immediately. That was just how the Liberties worked. You didn't trust a well-dressed man with a black bag who showed up asking questions about the poor, not without knowing who sent him and why. But nobody turned him away either, because that was also how the Liberties worked. You didn't make enemies of men who had power you couldn't see the edges of. Hargrove spent 2 days speaking to residents. He asked about diet. He asked about sanitation. He asked about the incidence of fever and the health of children in the district. And on the 3rd day, he asked about the Callahan twins. He didn't ask directly. That was what made it dangerous. He mentioned casually to Mrs. Duffy upstairs that he had heard some rather remarkable things about a pair of sisters in the lane. Children with unusual perceptual gifts, he called it, with a kind of detached academic excitement that he clearly thought was reassuring. He asked if Mrs. Duffy knew the family. He asked if she thought the father might be willing to speak with him. Mrs. Duffy came downstairs and knocked on Bridget's door within the hour. Bridget listened to her, thanked her, closed the door. Then she went to find Declan. She found him coming off the docks at dusk, still smelling of river water and rope, and she walked beside him for half a block before she spoke. "There's a doctor asking about the girls." Declan stopped walking. "University man," Bridget said. "Black bag. Been here 3 days. Mrs. Duffy told me." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that start polite and end somewhere else." She looked at him steadily. "He's not here for a health survey, Declan." Declan started walking again, faster. "I'll talk to him." "That's not what I want you to do. Bridget, I want you to find out who sent him." She caught his arm, stopped him again. "Before you say anything to him, before you let him anywhere near this house, find out who sent him." She was right. He knew she was right. That was the thing about Bridget. She had a way of seeing 3 steps ahead of a situation that Declan sometimes resented and always relied on. He found Hargrove the next morning at the corner tavern, drinking coffee and writing in a small leather notebook. Declan sat down across from him without being invited and put both hands flat on the table and said, "I'm Callahan. You want to talk about my daughters?" Hargrove looked up. If he was startled, he didn't show it. He closed the notebook slowly and said, "Mr. Callahan, yes, I was hoping we might meet." He had the careful, measured voice of a man who had been educated specifically to sound trustworthy. "I want you to understand that my interest is entirely scientific. The things I've heard about your girls are remarkable, genuinely remarkable. And I believe—" "Who sent you?" Declan said. A pause, very small, but Declan caught it. "I'm affiliated with Trinity College," Hargrove said. "The Department of Natural Philosophy." "That's not what I asked." Hargrove looked at him for a moment. Then he said carefully, "There are men of considerable standing who have an interest in understanding what your daughters are, what they represent, scientifically." He leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Callahan, I am not your enemy. The interest of these men, properly managed, could mean protection for your family, resources, security. You live in a very precarious position. The city is not friendly to—" He paused, chose his next word with visible precision. "To families in your circumstances." Declan stood up. "Stay away from my house," he said. He walked out, but as he pushed through the tavern door into the cold morning air, he felt something settle in his chest that was heavier than anger. Because Hargrove had said protection, and the word had landed somewhere in him before he could stop it, in that place where a man keeps the fears he doesn't say out loud, the fear of the mob, the fear of the priest, The fear of all the ways a poor Catholic family in Dublin could be destroyed by the wrong kind of attention. He didn't tell Bridget about the word protection. He should have. 2 weeks passed. Things were quiet in a way that felt like held breath rather than peace. The girls continued to be themselves, bright, strange, inseparable. Siobhán had started asking questions about why the stars moved and whether fish could dream. Aoife had started drawing the same shape over and over on every surface she could find. A kind of spiral, tight at the center, unwinding at the edges. Neither of them could explain where it came from. And then something happened that changed everything. On a wet Thursday morning, a boy named Finn Burke fell from a roof on the next street. He was 11 years old, the son of a bricklayer, and he fell 2 stories onto the cobblestones below and lay still. Men ran from 3 directions. Someone shouted for a doctor. Someone else ran for a priest. Siobhán and Aoife, who had been standing in the lane 20 yards away, turned at the exact same moment before the shout went up, before anyone had cried out, before anyone could have heard anything. They turned toward the sound of the impact with the identical, precise movement of 2 compass needles swinging north, and Siobhán said, in a voice that was not frightened, but was absolutely certain, "His left leg is broken. His head is bleeding on the inside. He needs to be kept still." 6 people heard her say it. The doctor, who arrived 20 minutes later, confirmed a fractured left femur. Finn Burke died 4 days later of a brain bleed that no surgeon in Dublin in 1838 had any means to treat. But 6 people had heard Siobhán Callahan describe the injuries before any doctor had touched the boy. By nightfall, the story had grown legs. By the following morning, it had grown teeth. The rumors now were not just strange, they were frightened. People were saying the girls had known because they caused it. People were saying Aoife's spiral drawings were hex marks. A woman named Margaret Flannery, whose sister's baby had died 2 months prior of fever, stood outside the Callahan Lane house and shouted that the Devil twins had cursed her family, that she had seen one of them looking at her sister's door the week before the baby sickened. Declan came to the door. He told her to go home. She didn't go home. 3 more women joined her. Declan closed the door and put his back against it and looked across the room at Bridget, who was standing with one hand on each of her daughter's shoulders, holding them close in that tight, protective way she had. Siobhán was looking at the door with a steady expression that was much too old for a 7-year-old's face. Aoife was staring at the floor, her lips moving slightly, as if counting something. "We can't stay here," Bridget said quietly. "I know. I mean tonight, Declan." "We can't stay here tonight." He looked at his daughters. He looked at his wife. He thought about Hargrove and his word, protection. And he hated himself for thinking about it. "I'll go to my brother Seamus," he said. "He has the room above the cooperage." "Go now," Bridget said, "before it gets dark." They left by the back alley, Declan carrying the younger girl, Bridget holding Siobhán's hand, both adults moving fast and low and silent, the way people move when they know they are being watched, even if they cannot see who is watching. They made it to Seamus's place without incident. But Hargrove had been in the lane that morning, standing at the edge of the crowd. Declan had not seen him. He had been watching the girls with an expression that was not frightened, was not angry, was not moved by any of the emotion churning through the crowd around him. He was taking notes. And 3 streets away, in a hired room, he sat down that evening and wrote a long letter to a man whose name he never said aloud in Dublin, a man who did not live in Ireland at all, but who had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of news. The letter described 2 children, their age, their appearance, their abilities, and at the bottom, in a neat clinical hand, Hargrove wrote 6 words that would set everything that followed into irreversible motion. "They are everything we were promised." The letter Hargrove sent did not take long to reach its destination. 14 days. That was all it took for the reply to arrive back in Dublin, delivered by a private courier who did not give his name to the innkeeper and was gone before anyone thought to ask. The reply was brief, 3 sentences. Hargrove read it twice, folded it carefully, and held it over the candle flame until it was ash. Then he finished his coffee and went back to work. Declan and his family had been staying at Seamus's place above the cooperage for nearly 2 weeks by then, and the walls were starting to close in. Seamus was a good man, broad like his brother, quieter, with a wife named Orla, who fed everyone without complaint and asked no questions. But the space was small, and there were 4 extra people in it now, and the girls were restless. Siobhán had started waking in the night, sitting up straight in the dark and saying things that nobody understood, words that didn't sound like Irish or English or anything Bridget recognized. Aoife would be awake at the same moment, every time, silent and watchful and drawing her spirals on whatever surface was within reach. Declan told himself it was stress. Children responded to stress. That was all this was. Bridget did not tell him what she actually thought. Not yet. On the 15th morning, Declan went back to the Lane house to collect the rest of their things. He went alone, early, before the street was fully awake. The house had not been touched. The door was intact. He moved through the rooms quickly, pulling clothes and documents and Bridget's herb bundles into a canvas sack, trying to be fast and invisible and ordinary. He was reaching for the last bundle on the shelf when he heard a footstep behind him. He turned. Hargrove was standing in the doorway. Not threatening, not aggressive, just standing there in his good coat with his hands loose at his sides and that careful, measured expression on his face that Declan was beginning to hate, the way you hate something that you can't quite grab hold of. "I did not force entry," Hargrove said immediately. "The door was unlocked. I want you to know that." "Get out of my house," Declan said. "Mr. Callahan, please, 5 minutes." Hargrove took 1 step inside and stopped. "I need you to hear what I'm going to tell you, because I believe your family's safety genuinely depends on it." Declan didn't move toward him and didn't move away. He stood with the canvas sack in one hand and every muscle in his body tight and waiting. Hargrove said, "There is a man coming to Dublin. His name is Lord Ashby. He is a man of considerable influence, in London, in Edinburgh, and in circles that reach further than either of those cities. He has been informed about your daughters." He paused. "He is not a man who takes no for an answer, Mr. Callahan. Not from a priest, not from a physician, and certainly not from a dockworker in the Liberties." The word landed exactly the way Hargrove intended it to. "What does he want?" Declan said. "He wants the girls." Hargrove's voice was flat now, the politeness stripped back just enough to show what was underneath. "For study. He has a facility, private, outside the city. He has done this before, identified children with unusual characteristics and brought them in for examination. He calls it preservation. He believes he is protecting them." "And what do you call it?" A long pause. Something moved through Hargrove's face, something that might have been discomfort in a man capable of it. "I call it inevitable," he said quietly. "Which is why I am here, Mr. Callahan. Not for him, for you. Because if you run, he will find you." "But if you cooperate, if you come willingly, on terms you negotiate, you have some control over what happens to your daughters. Some. That is more than you will have if you force his hand." Declan put the canvas sack down very slowly on the table. Then he crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed Hargrove by the front of his coat and put him against the wall with a force that knocked the breath out of him and rattled the single shelf above the door. "If any man," Declan said, very low, very deliberate, "comes near my daughters, I will put him in the river. Do you understand me? Hargrove, to his credit, did not flinch. He looked at Declan steadily, slightly breathless, and said, I understand you, but you should understand that Lord Ashby has already spoken to Father Sheehan, and Sheehan has agreed that the children represent a spiritual danger to the parish. Between a lord of the realm and a Catholic priest, Mr. Callahan, which side do you think Dublin will take? Declan let him go. He picked up his sack and walked out without another word. He walked fast, not running. Running drew attention, but fast. And his mind was moving faster than his feet, working through what Hargrove had said and what it meant and how much time they had. Sheehan and Ashby, church and money. That was not a combination you fought in 1838 Dublin, not as a poor Catholic dockworker with a foreign-sounding family name and 2 daughters the neighborhood already thought were cursed. He got back to Seamus's place and he told Bridget everything. She listened without interrupting, which she rarely did. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How long do we have? I don't know. He said Ashby is coming to Dublin. He didn't say when. Bridget stood up and went to where the girls were sitting together in the corner. Both of them quiet in that particular way they went quiet sometimes, as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. She crouched in front of them and looked at both their faces for a long moment. Siobhán looked back at her steadily and said, We have to leave Ireland, Mama. Bridget's breath caught. What did you say? We have to leave. Siobhán's voice was calm and certain in a way that a 7-year-old's voice should not be able to be. If we stay, the man with the black gloves will take us. Bridget looked at Aoife. Aoife was drawing her spiral again, slowly, on the wooden floor with one finger. Black gloves, Aoife said without looking up. He doesn't take his gloves off, even inside. Bridget stood up very slowly and looked at Declan across the room. He had gone pale. Neither of them had mentioned Lord Ashby to the girls. Neither of them had described him. Neither of them had ever heard a description of him. Declan said very quietly, Seamus, I need to talk to you. What followed happened quickly, the way necessary things happen when there is no time for anything else. Seamus had a contact. A man named Reardon who ran goods between Dublin and Liverpool on a coastal vessel that did not always appear on the official shipping manifests. Not a smuggler exactly, more of a man who understood that paperwork was a luxury and that certain passengers preferred discretion to documentation. Declan met Reardon that evening in the back of a grain warehouse near the quay. Reardon was small, sharp-eyed, and completely unsentimental. He looked at Declan and named a price for 4 passengers to Liverpool. No questions, no record. Declan didn't have the full amount. He had half. He told Reardon he would have the rest within 2 days. Reardon said the vessel left in 3 days. He said it once and did not repeat it. Declan went back to Seamus and borrowed what he was short without explaining why in full, and Seamus gave it without asking, which was the kind of brother he was. 2 days. They had 2 days. On the first of those 2 days, everything seemed to hold. The family stayed inside. The girls were quiet. Bridget packed what they could carry. Declan went to the docks for a half shift to avoid suspicion and came back without incident. He let himself believe, briefly, that it was going to work. On the second day, Father Sheehan came to Seamus's door. He did not come alone. He brought 2 men from the parish, large men, the kind kept around for situations that required more than prayer. And he stood at the door with that same flat, careful face and told Orla, who answered, that he needed to speak with Declan Callahan about a matter of urgent spiritual concern. Orla told him Declan wasn't there. Sheehan looked past her into the room and said, "Tell him Lord Ashby arrived in Dublin this morning." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "And tell him Lord Ashby is a patient man, but his patience does have a known end." He left. Orla closed the door and stood against it and pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at Bridget with wide eyes. Bridget was already moving. She had the girls on their feet and the bag in her hand before Declan came out of the back room. "Tonight," she said. "We go tonight. Don't argue with me." Declan did not argue. They left at midnight. All four of them, moving through the back lanes of Dublin in the dark and the wet and the smell of coal smoke and river mud. The girls walked between their parents, one hand each held tight, and neither of them made a sound. Not a question, not a complaint, not a word. At one point, in the darkest stretch of the route near the quay wall, Aoife stopped walking. Declan felt her hand go rigid in his, and he stopped and looked down at her. She was staring at a doorway across the lane. A man was standing in it, still, watching, wearing dark clothing and, even in the cold and dark, black gloves. Declan didn't breathe. The man did not move. After 3 seconds that felt like 3 years, Declan picked Aoife up off the ground, tucked her against his chest, and walked. Fast, not running, walking. His heart slamming against his ribs, Bridget's hand gripping Siobhán's so hard the child winced but did not cry out. They reached Reardon's vessel 20 minutes later. Liordan counted the money, pointed below deck, said nothing. The vessel left Dublin harbour 2 hours before dawn. Declan stood at the rail and watched the lights of the city disappear into the dark water and the fog, and he felt something inside him unclench for the first time in weeks. Just slightly, just enough to breathe. He did not yet know that the man in the black gloves had already sent a letter to Liverpool. He did not yet know that Lord Ashby had contacts on both sides of the Irish Sea, and he did not yet know that leaving Dublin had not ended the danger. It had only changed its address. Liverpool was not safety. Declan understood that the moment they stepped off Reardon's vessel into the grey morning noise of the docks, and he saw, standing 30 yards away, a man in a dark coat watching the gangplank with the patient stillness of someone who had been told exactly when to arrive. Not the man in the black gloves, different man, but the same stillness, the same quality of attention that was not curiosity, but inventory. Declan turned his body so that Bridget walked on his far side, putting himself between her and the man on the dock, and he kept moving without changing his pace, and he said nothing until they were 2 streets deep into the city and the sound of the harbor had dropped behind them. Then he said, "We were expected." Bridget said, "I know. I saw him." "What do we do?" She didn't answer immediately. She was holding both girls by the hand, one on each side, and Siobhán was looking up at her with that steady, too old expression, and Aoife was watching the street behind them with her head slightly tilted, the way she did when she was listening to something that existed slightly outside the range of everyone else's hearing. "We don't stay in Liverpool," Bridget said finally. "We were never going to stay in Liverpool. We keep moving." "Moving to where, Bridget? We have almost nothing left." She looked at him then, directly, and said 3 words that changed the entire shape of what was left of their lives. "America," she said. "New Orleans." Declan stared at her. "I have a cousin," she said. "Moira. She went 3 years ago with her husband. She wrote to me twice. She said there is work, there is a community. There are people who help Irish families come in without papers." She paused. "It's far enough that a lord of the realm with connections in Dublin and Liverpool might not follow." "Might not," Declan said. "Might not is better than what we have now." He couldn't argue with that. He had nothing better to offer her. So he nodded, and they found a lodging house that asked no questions, and they spent 4 days in Liverpool moving carefully, spending as little as possible, while Bridget wrote to her cousin Moira, and Declan found a broker who arranged passage on a vessel crossing to New Orleans in 10 days. Those 10 days were the longest of Declan's life. On the third day, he saw Hargrove, not close, half a block away, on the other side of the street, walking in the same direction as Declan, but not looking at him, or appearing not to look at him, which was different. Declan stopped in front of a shop window and watched the reflection, and saw Hargrove slow his pace, stop, buy something from a street vendor, and wait. Declan went back to the lodging house a different way, and told Bridget to keep the girls inside until he said otherwise. That night, he lay awake, listening to his daughters breathe in the next room, and he thought about what Hargrove had said in Dublin. Inevitable. That word had not left him. It sat in his chest like a stone. Because the thing about Hargrove was that he was not stupid, and he was not wrong about the shape of the world. A poor Catholic Irishman did not win against a lord with reach across 2 countries. That was simply the truth of 1838, the same brutal arithmetic that had governed Declan's entire life. Who had power and who did not, and what happened to people who did not when they tried to resist people who did. But Declan Callahan had one thing Lord Ashby had not counted on. He had Bridget. And Bridget, it turned out, had been doing something in those 4 days in Liverpool that she had not told Declan about. While he watched the streets and managed the money and arranged the passage, Bridget had been talking to people. Quietly, carefully, the way she did everything. She had found the network that existed in every port city in the British Isles in those years. The informal web of Catholic clergy, Irish emigrant societies, and dockworkers who moved information and people through the cracks in the official world. She had told a priest named Father Donnelly exactly enough of their situation to get his help without frightening him into refusing. And Father Donnelly had made 2 introductions and written 1 letter that was on its way to New Orleans ahead of them. She told Declan about it the night before they boarded. He sat and listened to her, and when she finished he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have worried about whether it was safe to trust them," she said. "And I needed you focused on getting us to the ship." He couldn't decide if he was angry or grateful, so he settled on both, which was a feeling he'd had about Bridget on several previous occasions in their marriage. The crossing took 6 weeks. 6 weeks on a vessel packed with Irish emigrants, most of them fleeing famine and landlord violence, carrying everything they owned in bundles smaller than the girls' bedrolls. The conditions were poor. The food was worse. 3 people died of fever before they reached mid-Atlantic, and the death toll on Irish emigrant vessels in those years was high enough that no one was entirely surprised, only grieved. But the twins did not get sick. Around them, adults coughed and burned and weakened. Children who had been healthy at embarkation were feverish within the first 2 weeks. But Siobhán and Aoife moved through 6 weeks of that crossing untouched, and this did not go unnoticed in the tight quarters of a ship where people had nothing to do but observe each other. A woman named Mrs. Corcoran, whose son had developed a bad fever on the 2nd week, came to Bridget in desperation and asked if she could help. Bridget gave the boy what she had: herbs, specific instructions, a poultice Declan didn't recognize. The boy improved. Mrs. Corcoran told 2 other mothers. Word spread the way word always spread in confined spaces, and the twins sat with 3 sick children on the 14th day and held their hands and spoke to them very quietly, and all 3 children's fevers broke that same night. By the time they reached New Orleans, half the ship knew the Callahan girls' names. The other half was afraid of them. New Orleans in 1838 was unlike anything Declan had prepared himself for. The heat alone was a physical shock, a wet, heavy weight pressing down from every direction that made Dublin's cold rain feel like a memory of something almost gentle. The smells were enormous and complicated. The noise was different from any city noise he had heard, and underneath all of it, in the faces of the people moving through the streets, in the invisible architecture of who walked where and how and whether they met your eyes, underneath all of it was the brutal, living machinery of slavery, which was not something Declan had understood from a distance, and could not pretend not to understand. She was a small woman, red-faced from the heat, fiercely practical, and she embraced Bridget for a long time without speaking, and then looked at the twins and said nothing at all for a moment. Then she said, "Father Donnelly's letter came. I know why you're here." She picked up one of the bags. "Come with me. Don't talk to anyone on the street until I tell you it's safe." They stayed with Moira and her husband Tomas in the Irish Quarter, in a house that was small but solid, surrounded by other emigrant families who had built a tight, watchful community in the margins of a city that had many margins to offer. Declan found dock work within a week. Bridget began quietly to practice her healing again, cautiously, among people who asked no questions and offered no information to outsiders. For 3 months, they breathed. And then the letter arrived. It came addressed to Bridget, in a handwriting she did not recognize, on paper that smelled faintly of something she associated with laboratories and coal. It said that in the current political climate of New Orleans, a foreign national family without proper documentation would find the law a very uncertain protection. It was signed not by Ashby, but by Hargrove. Bridget read it twice, and then she sat down at the table, and she put both hands flat on the surface, and she closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, both girls were standing in the doorway to the back room, watching her. Siobhán said, "He found us." It was not a question. Bridget said, "Yes." Aoife said, "He's not coming himself. He's going to send people here." Bridget looked at her youngest daughter, 7 years old, small, serious, drawing her spirals still on every available surface, and she felt something shift inside her. Not fear. She was past fear. Something harder than fear and more permanent. "How long?" Bridget said. Aoife thought about it for a moment. She held up 4 fingers. 4 days. Bridget stood up, folded Hargrove's letter, and put it in her pocket. Then she went to find Declan, and she told him that they were done running. Not because they had nowhere left to go, but because she had finally understood something that she should have understood months earlier, standing in that Dublin Lane house, watching her daughters know things they could not possibly know. The twins were not the ones in danger. They had never been the ones in danger. Every person who had tried to take them, expose them, use them, Father Sheehan, Hargrove, Lord Ashby, every one of them had made the same mistake. They had looked at 2 small girls and seen something to be seized and studied and controlled, and in doing so, they had failed to ask the only question that actually mattered. What happens when the thing you are hunting knows you are coming? Bridget looked at Declan and said, "We're not leaving New Orleans. We're going to end this here." Declan looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he looked at his daughters, who were standing side by side in the doorway with their identical faces perfectly calm. Siobhán met his eyes and said, "She's right, Papa." Aoife said, "We know what to do." And for the first time since Dublin, Declan Callahan was not afraid. He was ready.